Hey guys, Coach Logan here again. This is part 2 of my Caro-Kann series for white, where we're looking at the two knights variation. So the last video was just kind of like an intro and the common mistake that I see scholastic players from the black side make. Now we're going to get into some of the meatier stuff. So the main focus of this video and the next one is going to be this line where after e4, c6, knight c3, d5, knight f3, this is the two knights variation. The move that we're going to focus on now is if black plays bishop to g4, which makes a whole lot of sense. If you remember in the main line, the sort of the old main line where white plays, where instead of playing knight f3, white had played pawn to d4, that was the system where black, just to show that, where black would take this pawn so that he could develop this bishop. He doesn't have a square right now because f5 is controlled by the pawn and g4 by the queen. So after the move knight f3, though, black actually does have a square for this bishop. He can play the move bishop to g4, which if you're playing against like a good player is very likely the move you'll see. This is what I used to play when I played the Caro-Kann as my main response to e4, and I think it's just a logical move. Getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, then getting ready to play e6 makes perfect sense. So what I think white should do is immediately put the question to this bishop with the move pawn to h3. And black now has two choices, which we're going to look at both of them. They could either take the knight, which is what we're going to look at next video, or they can play bishop to h5. So today we're going to look at bishop to h5. And this makes some sense. Black is trying not to just give up the bishop pair right away and maintain this pin. But the downside to this is white can use his rapid development to create some serious pressure. So I think we should start with the move. And this fits a general theme where if you're ahead in development, you should look to open up lines. And white can do that here by playing e takes d5, c takes d5, and now immediately bishop to b5 check. With this bishop marooned on the king side, there's not really a great way to block this check in the way that black might be used to, so he has to play knight c6 here. Note that if he brings the knight to d7, this pawn could run into some issues on d5 via your knight, so he'll have to play knight to c6. And now, those of you who are chess kid fans in the audience, you'll know that when your opponent has a pinned piece, what do? Put pressure, right? So we want to play... we would really like to play knight to e5 to put pressure on this knight. Unfortunately, we're pinned. Okay, but because the threat of knight e5 is so powerful, I actually give us permission here to play pawn to g4. I know it's sometimes, your coaches will tell you, rightfully so, that you shouldn't just play h3 and g4 because it can weaken your king side. But the reality is that the move now knight to e5 is very strong. You're threatening to just win the game. If black falls asleep at the wheel here, and plays like e6 or something, this is just winning. Knight takes e6, forking the king and the rook. Black will have to move his king because he doesn't want to block with the queen. And you're just going to win material and probably win the game. So black needs to defend his knight. Only real reasonable way I've seen to do that is rook c8. And this, now it's kind of interesting. We use these pawns h3 and g4 in order to kick the bishop away. And it felt like we were just doing that for one reason, which was to free up our knight. But we actually can still use them aggressively now with the move pawn to h4. And similar to in the last video where this bishop on g6 actually ran into some threats from your h-pawn, once again, you are threatening to simply play h5 and trap the bishop. I know that if you play h5, they could play bishop e4, but then you'll notice you could still play f3 and then the bishop will be trapped, right? Like, I'll just show that, for instance. Let's say knight f6, h5. This bishop just ends up getting trapped anyway. It has run out of squares. Okay, so what's black going to do? Black here is most likely going to... Well, okay, so here they actually have a difficult decision to make. I'm just going to unhighlight these because they're distracting me. If they try to make a luft like they would normally do with a move like h6, once again, this pawn structure after knight takes g6, f takes g6 is just really unpleasant for black. This pawn is weak on g6. You can imagine later, say you play something like d4 and later queen to d3, it'll be targeting that pawn. It's not all that easy to defend that in a convenient way. So that's an issue. Their pawn structure just generally is not great. This is backwards. These are doubled. Their light squares are weak. They've got some pawns kind of stuck on dark squares, and they're missing their light squared bishop. You have a bishop pair. There's just a lot of problems for black here. It's not really looking for this. So what else is black going to do? One of my favorites is if they try to be aggressive here and play the move pawn to d4. And this gets at something that 2018 U.S. champion and the headliner for the ICN summer camps the last 2 years has said, and this is one of the main things he says as a coach. Sam Shanklin is the guy I'm talking about, but he says, if you have something you want to do and your opponent stops you from doing it, the first question you should ask yourself is, what happens if I just do it anyway? Well, you wanted to play h5. Your opponent made an immediate threat on your knight. What happens if we just play h5 anyway? Well, let's see. Say they take your knight. You take, and you'll notice your rook is actually pinning this h-pawn. So black can't really recapture with the pawn, otherwise you take their rook. Likewise, you're actually threatening to play g takes f7 mate. So for instance, if they take this, you're not going to take this back, this pawn back with the bishop. You're just going to play g takes f7, checkmate. That would be a pretty one. And lastly, if black plays like f takes g6, some of you who are clever with tactics, you might say, oh, you can play knight takes g6. The pawn is pinned, you're winning the rook. Problem is, white has a lot of loose pieces here, this bishop, this knight, this rook, and queen to d5 is very, very strong. They fork your rook, they fork your bishop. They're threatening to play queen to e4 check, which will fork your king and your knight. It's too many loose pieces for white, so we don't actually want to do that. Instead of knight takes g6, we have the much stronger move, queen to f3, which once again renews the threat of mate on f7, puts a third attacker on this knight on c6, and is covering the d5 square, so there's no more queen to d5 tricks for black. This is just completely winning for white. Okay, so after h4, the only move black can seriously play here is f6. And this threatens your knight, so you're going to take this. Once again, after they recapture, this pawn could become targeted, but they haven't created as many pawn islands. They took towards the center, which is generally better. They've also opened up their rook, and they've actually given their king a little home on f7, which we'll see in a second. So white here plays d4, pawn to e6, and now kind of a weird-looking move, but it actually will make some sense, queen to d3. And this move, the purpose of this is twofold. You're attacking this pawn on g6, threatening to take with check, and you're getting closer to castling queenside, which is where we want to tuck our king. So black is going to defend this pawn. The only real way to do that is king f7, which might seem a little bit weird that black's moving his king, but black is trying to argue that this little f7 square with these pawns all around it is like a nice little nest for the king. Okay, so now that black did that, their knight is also no longer pinned. So we want to get rid of that. We don't want to allow any knight to b4 stuff, so we're going to take this. Black recaptures. We continue bishop d2. I'm going to complete black's development. Castles, and after, say, knight e7, you get a position like this, and whenever I turn on the engines in this position, it always thinks it's just about even. Which maybe objectively it is, but from kind of experience both in this position and just playing a lot, I find that I never really trust black's king safety in this. And even if we don't have enough to checkmate black right off the bat, I feel like black's king will never totally be safe. And if they ever try to do anything active, say like they try to push pawns in the center where they have a majority, they're just going to further weaken their king, which will make checkmate more likely. So, and I think white has clearer plans to improve than black, so I think this position's more fun for white. For instance, I would just start out right away with playing something like h5. After takes, you've loosened black's king up a little bit, and I drew a few highlight arrows. I'm looking to eventually push this pawn, maybe bring a rook over first to g1, try to reroute my knight to the king side, and try to weaken black's king further. And in the meantime, it's not totally clear to me what black's going to do in response. Maybe they do have better pawn structure and a larger central mass of pawns, but I think, again, if they ever really try to use it, their king could come under serious danger. So this pretty much wraps up the bishop h5 response. So just to kind of go back to this, this was if black responds to 3h3 with bishop h5. So the main point was to take, check, and then play g4 with the idea of knight e5. In the next video, we'll talk about what happens if they just take on f3, which is more likely what you're going to see. So thank you.